Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. Here at the museum we tell the story of the British Army and the people who served in it from the Civil Wars to the present day through our galleries, collections, programmes and research. By coming here today you've already supported the museum, but you could do more. You could go to the shop, the cafe, or donate or become a member where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. This morning I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Naomi Paxton. Naomi is a performer, researcher and broadcaster. She's an associate fellow of the School of Advanced Study, University of London, an honorary fellow of the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, an AHRC BBC Radio 3 New Generation Thinker, and a member of the Magic Circle.
It's true.
Today, she will be exploring the ways in which the First World War impacted women's suffrage in Britain. Technical difficulties, if anybody online does have any technical difficulties, please be gentle with us. Usually refresh the screen, that works wonders, turn it off and on again. If your stream freezes, also there will be a chance for people online to ask questions at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Naomi.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Hello, thank you very much for joining us, and hello, the streamers. This is very exciting. Thank you for wanting to come and hear about this on a very cold Friday lunchtime. Yes, hello, I'm Naomi, and I'm going to be talking about the First World War and votes for women. So I'm going to do a little brief overview of the suffrage timeline before the First World War, for those that are not maybe familiar with it. Here are some of the suffrage societies you may have heard of. We've got the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, the red, white and green, the largest and oldest of the societies, the WSPU, the purple, white and green at the top there, the suffragettes, the Women's Freedom League, the gold, white and green, and then lots of many different organisations. The Women Writers' Suffrage League, the Tax Resistance League, the Men's League for Women's Suffrage, one of quite a few male-only leagues, the Jewish League, the Actresses Franchise League, the Church League, and the International Suffrage Alliance. So there are a huge range of suffrage societies by 1914, all with their own colours. So it's not all just purple, white and green. Pretty much any colour you're in today, I could find you a suffrage society to go with it. So here's some of the key flashpoints. So in 1866, the first mass petition for votes for women was presented to Parliament. So by the time the First World War started, they'd been campaigning for nearly half a century. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies was formed in 1897 and sort of run by Millicent Garrett Fawcett, whose statue is in Parliament Square. The Women's Social and Political Union was founded in 1903 in Manchester by Emmeline Pankhurst. And in 1907, the Women's Freedom League was created by former members of the WSPU who left and set up their own organisation. The first hunger striker was in 1909. She went in, Marion Wallace Dunlop went on hunger strike in prison in protest at not being treated as a political prisoner. And in 1911, hundreds of suffragists across the UK boycotted the census. 1913, the year before war breaks out, an enormous women's suffrage pilgrimage takes place across England and Wales. And of course, Emily Wilding Davison dies after sustaining injuries at the Epsom Derby. So, by 1914, there were more than 50 suffrage societies across the UK, representing different professions, faiths, interests, locations, and methods of campaigning. There were all male societies, all female societies, and groups open to both women and men. Once war was declared, militancy and violent direct action was formally brought to a halt, but suffragists continued to peacefully campaign for votes for women throughout the war years. So the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies shifted the focus of its wartime campaign towards welfare work. Some smaller groups continued to keep the suffrage flag flying, especially the religious societies such as the Church League for Women's Suffrage and the Catholic Women's Suffrage Society. And members were encouraged to wear suffrage badges whilst undertaking their welfare work to make sure that the question of suffrage remained in the public eye. They also continued to meet together as suffrage workers in a number of suffrage clubs set up throughout Britain during the war. Even before the war, the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, that's their badge at the top there, and its newspaper represented the pacifist voices of women in 26 countries. In April 1915, over 1,300 women met at The Hague for the International Women's Congress, and resolutions were made calling for peace, cooperation and equality. Not all suffrage campaigners agreed with stopping the fight for votes for women during the First World War. Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst ordered the members of their Women's Social and Political Union to stop all militant actions, and they turned their attention to patriotism and changed the name of their newspaper from the Suffragette to Britannia, and all suffragette prisoners in jail were released. In the ranks of the Women's Social and Political Union, they didn't want to stop campaigning. They challenged the attitude of their union's leadership. So these were much smaller, but they recorded their activities, which included meetings and pressuring politicians, in 2 publications, the Suffragette News Sheet and the Independent Suffragette, that were published monthly. So this organisation, the Suffragettes of the WSPU, remained active at least until the autumn of 1917, and the Independent WSPU until 1919. So even though the kind of hardline militants were officially disbanded, they did break out and carry on campaigning. I'm going to talk about some of the work that you may not be familiar with. I know there's a lot of things you can look up about First Votes for Women, and also about the organisations that were involved, particularly in the armed forces during the First World War. But I want to talk about some of the things you may not have heard about suffrage campaigners and the wartime work they were part of. Other militant activists, in fact, quite a lot of activists, found their home in the United Suffragists. This was a group formed just before the war that hoped to be an organisation free from some of the toxic issues around leadership, partiality and attitudes to violent activism that had plagued other suffrage societies. So the United Suffragists was open to women and men and had a large network of provincial branches, and they took over the Votes for Women newspaper. Charlotte Despard of the Women's Freedom League was a pacifist and became a member of the executive committee of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. The Women's Freedom League also suspended militancy but continued to campaign for suffrage during the war. In the East End of London, Sylvia Pankhurst's East London Federation of Suffragettes continued to organise working class women and increasingly drew in male supporters, becoming the Workers' Suffrage Foundation in 1916. So the ELFS opposed the war on socialist and political grounds and was against conscription and wartime restrictions on free speech. And of course we have the Actresses Franchise League. That's my personal area of research, is the contribution of theatre professionals to the Votes for Women movement. So I will be championing their wartime work today. They were founded in 1908 and brought together women and men of the theatre to use their powers for good. They produced suffrage plays and lectures and were neutral in regard to tactics, which meant that they had members that were both supportive and not supportive of militancy. So they're a really interesting group to study. Suffragettes and suffragists remained active during the war because they wanted to keep their campaign going. While they recognised that wartime circumstances brought opportunities for women to undertake more public roles, they also were determined not to drop their suffrage identities, but to keep the campaign in the public eye. And one way of doing this was through the publication of suffrage newspapers, which continued to be published through the war years, although less frequently than they had done before 1914. As I said, Votes for Women was the paper of the United Suffragists, The Vote was the paper of the Women's Freedom League, and The Common Cause was the paper of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. Sylvia Pankhurst's paper, The Women's Dreadnought, was founded in 1914 and became the Workers' Dreadnought by 1917. All these publications are available to look at for free online through the Women's Library at LSE and also through Google newspapers. So if you're at all curious, it's one of the most exciting and interesting ways to work out what was going on day to day in the war for suffragist campaigners, as well as their connections nationally and internationally. So do check those out if you're interested. So this is a quote from Lady Randolph Churchill. I'm going to read it out because people on the stream may not be able to see it. An adequate representation of the work undertaken by the various women's suffrage organisations of Great Britain during the progress of the war would be almost of an encyclopedic nature. So, the First World War offered women unprecedented opportunities to move into the world of work. The infrastructures of the campaign for women's suffrage provided an ideal framework for the organisation of this work, enabling them to maximise both range and political impact. The London Society for Women's Suffrage, part of the National Union, set up the Women's Service Bureau in 1914 in order to fit qualified women workers to the many available jobs left vacant by men. They recruited and trained women for an extraordinary range of occupations, including providing the London General Omnibus Company with its first 100 ticket collectors, setting up ladies' automobile workshops to train women mechanics, and founding a training school for welders. By the end of the war, the WSB had been involved in and consulted over virtually every kind of women's work, from the provision of nurses and service women to toy making, glass blowing, and dentistry. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to mention a few organisations that you may not be so familiar with, in the hope that it whets your appetite to find out more, and some of the things that I've just really enjoyed finding out in this research. So this is Nina Boyle and the Women's Police Service. The women activists, both suffragists and others, had practical experience of encountering the justice system in court and on the streets, and concerns around short sentences, particularly for people convicted of violence against women and girls, had long been part of the suffragist campaign. So the Women Police Service was founded in September 1914 by anti-vivisection campaigner Margaret Damer Dawson and journalist and Women's Freedom League activist Nina Boyle. Boyle had long thought it unfair that female victims of sexual assault had to give evidence to all male courtrooms, and had been calling for the formation of women police to take statements and escort witnesses since 1912. So the Women Police Service started in September 1914, and within 2 years, commercial factories, royal parks, and over 27 towns and cities have been supplied with police women. So by now there were constables and officers in uniform, the fabulous uniform, on the streets of towns and cities across the UK, patrolling outside munitions factories, railway stations, and YMCA huts, and taking a special interest in the law affecting women and children. What's quite interesting about this organisation is because it was entirely all female and run by women, it was much more, it wasn't bound really by a lot of the rules around particularly access to employment for married women. There were headquarters, they trained in drill, first aid, criminal and civil law, and jiu-jitsu, which had been a huge Edwardian craze. The three big crazes of the Edwardian era: jiu-jitsu, vegetarianism, and roller skating. The suffragettes were all over them, and this continued during the First World War. Less so the roller skating, but definitely the jiu-jitsu. Recruits came from many fields. So there were policewomen who had been artists, teachers, writers, social workers, dressmakers, and domestic servants. New recruits had to be over 21, but they accepted applications from married women and from mothers. So they sort of had a temporary cut-off date at the age of 45, but there were exceptions, and some of their finest officers were over 50 years old. So they were really privileging experience and valuing women's experience. So they were training in, yes, the law as it relates particularly to women and children, police procedure in the courts, and practical training on the streets. And in contrast to the very feminine appearance of some of the WSPU or the suffragettes before the First World War, the Women's Police Service had a very militaristic, masculine appearance, with the senior officers cropping their hair and calling each other sir. I just love the boots. I love the boots. By the end of the war, 10% of the women trained by the Women Police Service had previously been in service. It's quite interesting, there is a real resistance. The Chief Commissioner of Police really disliked the WPS recruits and refused to make them a permanent part of the police force, despite their experience. After the war, this organisation continued as a voluntary service, becoming the Women's Auxiliary Service in 1920. As well as volunteering at home and abroad, women also served, of course, as part of the armed forces, so with the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps in 1916, followed by the Women's Royal Naval Service in 1917, and the Women's Royal Air Force a year later. And the latter merged members of the Women's Royal Naval Service and the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, who were working on air stations belonging to the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Service. When the services were disbanded after the war, over 100,000 women have served. I'm not going to talk too much about those because there's lots of information, particularly here, around QMAC, absolutely. So I'm going to move on to another organisation, another formidable woman. This is Elsie Inglis. Many skilled women wanting to help the war effort were discouraged from doing so. When Dr. Elsie Inglis offered her services to the War Office in 1914, she was told to, quote, go home and sit still. Tee-hee. Instead, she set up the Scottish Women's Hospitals, supported and funded by the Scottish Federation of Women's Suffrage Societies, and that also affiliated to the National Union. The organisation comprised 14 units involving more than 1,000 women that saw active service in France, Serbia, Russia, Romania, Salonika and Macedonia, and by 1917 had branches on the Western and Eastern fronts. The units were almost entirely staffed by women, and Inglis understood that as the National and the Suffrage Press would report all the Scottish Women's Hospital activities. So they worked for the war effort and did it in the public eye. So over 1 million additional women entered into paid employment over the course of the war. Women workers in a number of different industries, including transport, munitions and manufacturing, were encouraged by suffrage campaigners to make their voices heard. And many went on strike to agitate for equal pay for equal work, as well as for better and safer working conditions. Initially, the voluntary work done by women was barely acknowledged, financially unsupported, and undervalued by the very organisations these organisations were trying to help. Actress manager Lena Ashwell remembered that, quote, weekly lists were sent to the War Office containing full particulars as to the numbers of women we could supply for transport, cooks, interpreters and so forth, and each week a letter was received in acknowledgement saying that women were not needed. Organisations like the Scottish Women's Hospital saw this sort of ludicrous and shameful, noting that the Home Secretary had refused the services of women interpreters and the offer of, quote, 25 women motorcyclists able to repair their own and other people's machines have been similarly neglected. And how about the post office work, the ticket selling, the express message carrying and other useful and necessary employments that are now suspended or working short? Women could carry them on just as well as men while men are in the field. But no women need apply has been this narrow-minded government's rule, whether for votes or anything else, end quote. This is a detail of a cartoon from the front of the newspaper Votes for Women. So if you can't see, this is a woman here, ball and chain, says sex disqualification. And she's got a bracelet that says Red Cross Society, Women's Emergency Corps, and the Women's Service Corps. I do think that a significant part of the success of women's work in the First World War was the fact they had been so organised as part of the suffrage movement and had been used to not taking no for an answer and finding ways to raise money to support each other and to gain national support and also kind of work the press in a way that was useful for them. So they were frustrated but not intimidated by the government's lack of support. There are some really strange anomalies. So the first permanent ambulance service in London was formed in 1879, and women were first employed as drivers for the service in 1915, and by 1916, July 1916, the London County Council Ambulance Corps was staffed entirely by women. But despite the willingness of London taxicab drivers to let women drive, Scotland Yard refused to licence them, stating that women could not handle luggage and would be quote, exposed to unpleasant experiences at night. Strange. The Daily Mail, an unlikely supporter, reported in January 1916 that, quote, if Scotland Yard would sanction the experiment, a plentiful supply of women, trained drivers and well-disciplined could be obtained through large bodies of hard-working patriotic women. These bodies have already offered to come to the aid of the cab companies and the public, but the police say no. So the first female taxi driver, Marie White, was not licensed in London until 1977. Very good. Gasp, gasp, very good. Okay, so let's talk about drivers. This is the excellent Vera Jack Home. She was born in 1881 in Ormskirk. She became a professional performer in her early 20s, joining the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company at the Savoy Theatre and appeared in a number of Gilbert and Sullivan operas as part of the Ladies' Chorus. Vera had joined the Actresses Franchise League and the Women's Social and Political Union. In 1908, she took part in marches, demonstrations, deputations, processions, and she initiated the selling of suffrage newspapers on the streets. She became chauffeur to WSPU leader Emmeline Pankhurst in 1911. You can just about see Emmeline Pankhurst in the back of that beautiful car. And was, according to the Chauffeur magazine, Britain's only female chauffeur at that time. Interesting. So she is dressed in her uniform and wearing an RAC badge of efficiency. She drove Mrs. Pankhurst around in this Austin landaulet owned by the WSPU. In 1915, she and her companion, Evelina Haverfield, joined the Scottish Women's Hospitals in Serbia, and she used her motoring expertise as an ambulance driver. In 1918, she was awarded the Samaritan Cross by the King of Serbia in recognition of her work with the Scottish Women's Hospitals and a Russian Medal for Meritorious Service. And at the end of the war, she helped set up the Haverfield Fund for Serbian Children and maintained her connections with the Serbian people. She was awarded a big shiny thing by the Royal Yugoslav Embassy in 1943. There were many other members of the Actresses Franchise League who also did war service directly. Adeline Bourne, who was one of the founders, served as an officer in Cumac and worked as an acting paymaster in the War Office. Olga Nethersole joined the Voluntary Aid Detachment and nursed at Hampstead Military Hospital and then founded the People's League of Health in 1917. Actress and playwright Cicely Hamilton helped to set up the first 200-bed auxiliary hospital at Royaumont Abbey in France in 1914 and remained there in 1917 when she returned to England. We have sat next to Vera Home is Edith Craig, who was Ellen Terry's daughter. More of her later. But yes, she was also a member of the WSPU and the Actresses Franchise League. So I'm going to turn quickly to a couple of the wartime projects from the Actresses Franchise League and tell you a little bit about them, because I think theatrical suffragists were in a really unique position. In the labour economy, they were freelance. They had sort of stepped out of some of the conventions of society by training and working on the stage, and they had experience of supporting their own families and also of touring the UK extensively. So yes, the Actresses Franchise League, as I said, was founded in 1908 and became this bond of union for all women in the theatrical profession. So they produced and commissioned plays, but they also did films. They had sketches, magic shows, ballet performances, dance performances, all kinds of music. And they were just a tremendously successful and ambitious organisation that contributed, because they, as I said, they were politically neutral, they worked with all the other suffrage societies, so they were incredibly well networked. When war broke out, they watched it. So this is a quote from May Whitty, who's an actress, a name some of you may recognise. This is from her diaries, August the 4th, 1914. Also strange, unreal, wild rumours of naval engagements, ships sunk, the streets as we walked home were full of excited people waving flags, then the tension, the rumours, the hopes, the fear, and life went on. The Actresses Franchise League started organising the Women's Emergency Corps. Meetings every day, women came from all over the country to register for service, and here the work for suffrage showed its value. Women were organised, trained, ready to face dangers. The Women's Emergency Corps was founded by members of the Actresses Franchise League just 2 days after the outbreak of war and devised to be, quote, elastic, unhampered by political or social prejudices and prepared to undertake any work that should be useful, whatever that work might prove to be, end quote. So 4 days after the foundation of that organisation, 2,000 women had volunteered to drive motor cars, to ride or drive horses, to take care of creches of kindergartens, to cook, to sew, to speak several foreign languages or serve in any other way. And they were freed from any negative association with the suffrage movement, in spite of the involvement of prominent militants like Emmeline Pethick-Lawrence on its committee. Anti-suffragists were as welcome as suffragists to volunteer their services. So the Women's Emergency Corps provided a safe space for such collaboration, united as it was around the war effort and the employment of women rather than political activism. They held regular and free meetings in theatres and venues across the UK to appeal for funds and update supporters. And they were based initially at the Little Theatre, just behind the Strand, which is just around the corner from the offices of the Actresses Franchise League and the Women's Freedom League. By January 1915, the Corps had 15 branches across England and Wales and 18 departments, including clerical work, housecraft, interpreting, land development, medical and nursing, National Food Fund, needlework, toy industry, and the Women's Volunteer Corps. The Corps organised the teaching of French and German in over 40 military centres outside London, published 2 books of French and German phrases, subtitled The Soldier's First Aid to Foreign Languages. It's a great book, for English soldiers abroad. The Corps provided interpreters as part of a large network of women's groups and societies helping Belgian refugees arriving at London stations to find accommodation, work and medical treatment, and if necessary, legal advice. And these volunteers came from both suffrage and non-suffrage backgrounds. So the toy department, in particular, was a huge success, developing original designs and registering a trademark. So this enterprise was widely reported in the press soon after it began, and the toys sold very well. As you can see, there is a really interesting range. The toy-making department worked with a number of designers, including a curator of the Tower of London Armouries, Charles Fuchs, to design a wooden model of Henry VII. That's the statue there. Very cool. By February 1915, the number of women working in the toy-making department had grown considerably, with the Women's Emergency Corps reporting there were 20 branches across the UK employing 228 women workers. They produced a huge range of projects and products, many of which have been designed by their makers, and offering us a really interesting experience, a glimpse into the experience of wartime women at home and abroad. So items we have here include an ambulance wagon with stretchers and figures of Red Cross nurses. There we are. A realistic mud trench at the top there, complete with barbed wire, sandbags and blackened tree stumps, which had been designed by the mother and wife of 2 soldiers at the front. For younger children, there were wooden Belgian dogs, drawing carts, khaki-clad Tipperary Tommy dolls, and apparently a very realistic penguin called Simon, pictured there with actress-manager Lena Ashwell. So in March 1915, the Women's Emergency Corps exhibited their toys at the British Industries Fair, held at the Agricultural Hall in London. And they were not alone in representing women's labour at the fair, as the newly formed East London Federation of Suffragettes Toy Factory had also a stand selling dolls and wooden toys. So accounts of this industry's fair show that the wartime ban on German toys had opened up opportunities for British designers and manufacturers. So with German toys no longer desirable, military items made by British makers flooded the market, and safely at home, children could play at war. This is a whole other talk, but the games and toys, the example of the toys on sale in March and April 1915 is really interesting. There were searchlights worked by electric batteries, anti-aircraft guns, armoured cars, and a torpedo dreadnought battleship that would explode on the pressing of a button, sending the deck, guns and turrets flying. The cheery headlines in the toy manufacturing journals contrasted with the grimness of the descriptions of the toys. But among the bloodthirsty games, there were also more innocent musical pleasures to be had. One of my favourites is an intriguing contraption called the drummophone, billed as the most wonderful music invention to accompany any martial music on a piano or gramophone. So it's a pole with a Union Jack at the top, a pair of cymbals just below, and a kettle drum halfway down. And it's played by pulling a serrated bow across the pole to activate the drum, which must have been noisy. I just want to point out, oh yes, this is, excuse me, that's their, so they did register a trademark, the Women's Emergency Corps toy stand, and they made a great deal of money, and they were selling their toys across the UK and in major, they actually had a shop on Oxford Street to sell their toys and the work made by women who were in the Women's Emergency Corps workrooms. The Actresses Franchise League was very aware that many women of the theatre, women and men of the theatre, were thrown out of work by the war, and so they were trying to provide many employment opportunities as possible, and for people who were makers, they could sell their wares. I just want to point up this picture here in the middle, these caricature figures. So these represent the King, Lord Kitchener, Sir John French, Sir John Jellicoe, and General Joffrey. In December 1914, the Women's Emergency Corps workrooms had produced a geyser, a figure of the Kaiser, to be stuffed with straw and burnt on Guy Fawkes Night. We don't have a picture of that, sadly. But attached to each figure was the following verse. We shall all remember the 5th of November by Wilhelm's infernal plot. We see no reason why Germany's treason should ever be forgot. The geysers were on sale at public meetings, and Lena Ashwell, pictured with Simon there, told the Daily Chronicle that she took 100 geysers to Cardiff for a Women's Emergency Corps meeting and could have sold 3 or 4 times that number. Although thousands of toys were made and sold by the Women's Emergency Corps toy factories over the course of the war, there are none known to be held in museum or archive collections, meaning that the work of these creative women designers and makers has been forgotten. If you do happen to have one trademarked with a lion's claw, please do let me know, especially if it's Simon the Penguin. Okay, so this is a quote from playwright Israel Zangwill. Again, I'm going to read it out. If the battles of England are won on the playing fields of Eton, they may also be won in the playhouses of Piccadilly. Let us hope the Women's Theatre will help to win them. The Women's Theatre Project was a project set up by the Actresses Franchise League in 1913 and was designed to change the practice of commercial theatre forever, basically to create opportunities for women to work backstage, to work in administration, and to create an old girls network that could work with the old boys network so that future generations of performers were not limited by their gender. And they had set up, the Women's Theatre first season was in 1913 and had produced work by 2 male playwrights in order to sort of dispel any claims that they were anti-man. So women were running all the business of the stage and backstage, and men were writing plays and also part of the performances. But they really wanted to do something radical, and this was part of a wider international. This had been happening in the States from the 1890s, was also happening in Europe. There were various women's theatre initiatives to try and change the kind of systemic inequalities in the industry and give more women opportunities to participate at an equal level. So there were big dreams for the women's theatre from 1914, but then war broke out. So, of course, they adapted and diversified in response to the changing environment. They created a spin-off venture called the Women's Theatre Camps Entertainments to support the war effort and entertain troops at home and abroad. Just one of the very many groups of theatre people going around entertaining. But this one's specifically allied to the Actresses Franchise League. So the League's president, Gertrude Elliott, became president of the Women's Theatre Camps Entertainments, and their first performance was at Aldershot in November 1914. 1915 and 16 saw demand for the League's suffrage propaganda fall, but their war work flourished, with the Women's Theatre Camps Entertainments giving 300 entertainments in 1915 and over 600 the following year in clubs, huts, hospitals and camps. Averaging 6 to 8 concerts per week, the League employed 451 artists over this period. The last performance seems to have been in Surbiton in 1917, that's as far as I can get, and featured storytelling, short plays, songs and musical recitals. The programme for that performance, this one here, proudly stated that over the first 6 months of 1917, 426 concerts had been given by the organisation. Actress and playwright Elizabeth Robbins celebrated the success of the women's theatre in wartime and the transforming power of theatre amongst wounded troops. Quote, "The closer we women come to the realities of war, the better we understand the function of theatre in such times as these. Not for this was the women's theatre founded, but the women's theatre has taken up with energy and marked success its rightful share in war service." End quote. I'm going to mention another unlikely space for suffragist women. This is the YMCA Shakespeare Hut. Some of you may already know about it. But there was a very strong suffragist presence there. So this was built by the YMCA in Bloomsbury in 1916 on land owned by the Shakespeare Memorial National Theatre Committee. And it was intended, the land, to be the site of a monument to celebrate Shakespeare's tercentenary and eventually to be the location of the new National Theatre. But the land was offered to the YMCA as a contribution to the war effort. And this hut, which was unique in having a dedicated theatre space, was built for the use of New Zealand Anzac servicemen, known affectionately as diggers, offering entertainment and shelter for those on leave and recuperating from injuries. It was staffed day to day by around 350 women volunteers from the local area. And unlike all the other YMCA facilities erected in London at the time, the Shakespeare Hut was commemorative, so it retained a sort of mock Tudor. Hut is misleading, it was an enormous complex. If you know where the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine is in Bloomsbury, that's the site where that was. So it retained its sort of Shakespearean theme via its entertainments and education and contained its own purpose-built theatre hall. It had a dedicated theatre space. So even though there were performances going on, for example, at the Beaver Hut, the Canadian Hut, or at the Eagle Hut, the American Hut, the Anzac Hut was the only one that had a dedicated theatre space as part of it. The entertainments at the hut were managed by Gertrude Elliott, the president of the Actresses Franchise League, and the performances were directed by Edith Craig, daughter of suffragist and actress Ellen Terry, previously pictured next to Vera Home in the beautiful car. Shakespearean extracts, one-act plays, sketches, skits and concerts made up the diverse productions on the hut's tiny stage, performed often by some of the greatest performers of the day, such as Johnston Forbes Robertson, Ben Greet, Martin Harvey, and of course Ellen Terry herself. I've included this one here. This is a programme for the Christmas entertainments at the Shakespeare Hut in 1916. There's character songs, there's extracts from Shakespeare, and there's a one-act play called A Bit of Blighty by Evelyn Glover, who's a suffrage playwright, who had lots of plays performed by the Actresses Franchise League. I just wanted to flag this one up. This is really interesting. This is performed at the Shakespeare Hut before it appeared in professional theatres at the end of January 1917. The play is actually set in one room in a tenement dwelling in South London and features 3 female characters. So Mary, a munitions worker and the sweetheart of a soldier stationed in France, his mother, Mrs. Eagle, and Miss Holt, a photographer from the Snapshots from Home League. And she's basically in her Sunday best and having her photo taken so it can be sent to her soldier sweetheart at the front. It's a really interesting slice of domestic life, which may have been comforting for the Anzac service personnel who are perhaps missing their own womenfolk. It's also very cheap and easy to stage. It's just 3 performers in one space. But because there's a whole camera set up and there's a lot of talk about what's going on in the munitions factories, what's going on socially, and what's happening with the female photographer in her career, it's an interesting glimpse into the lives of creative women during wartime. And I love that it was performed at the Hut. I also love that many of these Anzac service personnel would have no idea that they were seeing some of the most famous suffragist performers of their day performing in front of them. So that's the Shakespeare Hut. The other place that the Actresses Franchise League were very hugely involved in was the military hospital, the Endell Street Military Hospital. I know many of you may know about this. Obviously, many medical women saw the war as an opportunity to advance their professional as well as their political cause. So WSPU members Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett-Anderson set up the Women's Hospital Corps in France and then in Britain, and eventually became the first women doctors to work with the Royal Army Medical Corps. They ran efficient, successful hospitals and continued to wear their WSPU colours of purple, white and green on their uniforms throughout the war, so nobody could forget their allegiance to the women's cause. So the Endell Street Military Hospital in Covent Garden was the first to be staffed entirely by women. So it was opened in 1915 by Murray and Garrett Anderson, and proudly adopted the WSPU motto, "Deeds, not words." So it had over 500 beds on site and was busy from the moment it opened, catered to patients' psychological as well as medical needs, boasting a library, gardeners, sports days, and a huge variety of entertainments. So Actresses Franchise League and Women Writers Suffrage League members were involved as volunteers, with Beatrice Harraden and Elizabeth Robbins as librarian and assistant librarian, hence the picture of the library here. And the people who ran the Women's Theatre Committee, Inez Ben-Susan, and of course May Whitty on the Entertainment Committee. Again, service personnel were having encounters with suffrage campaigners that they never could have anticipated. And the library was stocked with stirring suffrage texts, which is also very pleasing. This is a programme for as it's pantomime season, for the Grand Pantomime of Cinderella, which it's extraordinary. I wasn't able to print out the whole thing, but there are scenes set in the Endell Street Hospital and a really interesting cast made up sometimes of the orderlies at the hospital and others of West End performers who were, say, released by so-and-so production manager in order to appear in the pantomime at the Endell Street Hospital. So again, there are suffragist women who are doing very good war work, but are also making sure that their suffragist affiliations are constantly in full view. We'll talk about one more project that the Actresses Franchise League were part of, the British Women's Hospital Fund. So the British Women's Hospital Fund was formed in July 1915 and based at the Actresses Franchise League offices. The purpose was the refurbishment and conversion of the Star and Garter Hotel in Richmond in Surrey into a home for permanently disabled soldiers and sailors. So this was absolutely part or very much sort of affiliated to the suffrage campaigning, as well as a lot of the patriotic campaigning of the time. They had banners, marches to raise money, sandwich boards throughout the West End, including all-female bands in uniform from the Church Nursing and Ambulance Brigade, very much reminiscent of the WSPU bands before the First World War. And the minutes book of the committee show that the support for the project gathered quickly. They had Dr. Flora Murray from the Endell Street Military Hospital on the medical committee and an extensive list of titled women as patrons of the fund. And the governing committee liaised with Edith Craig, the Women's Emergency Corps, publishers, politicians and theatre managers to arrange public meetings and fundraising opportunities. They also used... Adeline Bourne wrote to speak on behalf of the British Women's Hospital, saying that she wanted to hold a recruiting meeting. The subject to stir them is Edith Cavell. So this is October 1915. Cavell, a nurse stationed in Brussels, had been shot at dawn by the German army on the 12th of October for assisting the escape of Allied soldiers. An international protest had followed her arrest and execution, and her story and her memory was potent with patriotic and moral power. So the committee of the British Women's Hospital had decided to associate and perpetuate the name of Edith Cavell, and they wanted to appeal to supporters to raise funds to name a wing of the Star and Garter home after her. An appeal was duly made in the press, and Bourne publicly sought and gained the approval of Cavell's sister for the campaign. So at the end of the war, the Star and Garter home was one of the Actresses Franchise League's most successful ventures. They raised £150,000, that's over £10 million, 3 times the amount they initially wanted. So, to the vote. Before 1914, only 58% of men had the vote. By 1916, it had become clear that the next general election could not use the pre-war electoral register, as many men on military service had been out of the country too long to meet the residency qualifications. There was also strong feeling amongst politicians on all sides that previously unenfranchised men who had been conscripted into the forces or otherwise contributed to the war effort deserved the vote. A cross-party conference of 32 MPs and peers was formed to discuss electoral reform. It's known as the Speakers' Conference, with Speaker Lowther as chairman. Women's suffrage campaigners saw their opportunity and lobbied politicians extensively. Concerned about enfranchising too many women by giving them the vote on the same terms as men, in January 1917, the conference recommended that an age limit of 30 or 35 be set and left the House of Commons to debate which. 2 months later, over 80 women representing 24 suffrage societies and also other women's organisations took part in a deputation to the Prime Minister. And this is the document here. So you have, again, we have people from across the kind of suffragist political spectrum: Millicent Garrett Fawcett, Emmeline Pankhurst, Charlotte Despard, Margaret Damon Dawson of the Women's Police Service, the Chief Lady Factory Inspector, Dr. Garrett Anderson from Endell Street, Gertrude Elliott, President of the Actresses Franchise League, representatives of the National Women's Labour League, the National Union of Women Workers, and representatives of 24 suffrage societies. We have this whole document. So this is what Millicent Garrett Fawcett said, quote, we should greatly prefer an imperfect scheme that can pass to the most perfect scheme in the world that could not pass. But we suffragists have always known that the work of women was nationally indispensable. No nation is sustained, either in peace or war, by the work of one sex only. It is sustained by the work of both sexes combined. And this, which we have always perceived, has come to many as a revelation, made clear by the great searchlights of war. And as soon as they perceive it, they too begin to become suffragists. So now that we have an immense volume of opinion behind us and supporting us, much as we never had before. What's interesting is that a lot of people criticise members of the large sort of suffrage organisations for taking the limited franchise. But it's clear from this deputation document, which documents all the discussions going on, that Mrs. Fawcett and the other suffrage campaigners desperately wanted women on the same terms as men. But David Lloyd George, who was by then the Prime Minister, encouraged them to take the limited franchise. This is what he said. The strength of our position is that we are acting upon an agreed report. The moment you depart from that, I think it will mean disaster to the whole of the proposals, and therefore I am perfectly certain the strength of the women's position is to stand by this. I know it is illogical. I know it is unjustifiable to limit it. Friends inside the Commons felt that this was the utmost they could carry by anything in the nature of consent. And for that reason, I strongly urge you, however unpalatable it may be, and however undesirable from the point of view of excluding a very, very considerable number of women who have rendered great service in this war, I strongly urge you to stand by this proposal and say that this will satisfy you. So, the vote for some. The passing of the Representation of the People Act in 1918 tripled the electorate from 7.7 million, 28% of the adult population in 1910, to 21.4 million, 78% of the adult population in 1919. Virtually all men over the age of 21 got the right to vote. Military and naval service personnel got the vote at the age of 19. Women over 30 who met property qualifications got the vote, becoming 43% of the electorate. Women over 30 who were university graduates obtained a second vote in their university constituencies, and conscientious objectors were disenfranchised for 5 years. The Parliament Qualification of Women Bill was passed in November 1918. Although women could not vote until they were 30, they could now stand as parliamentary candidates if they were 21 years or over. With just a few weeks to prepare, 17 women stood in the 1918 general election, but the only one to be elected, Constance Markowitz, was a member of Sinn Féin and therefore did not take her seat. The first female MP to take her seat was Nancy Astor, who was elected at a Plymouth by-election in November 1919. So, what difference did the war make? When some women got the vote in 1918 after over half a century of campaigning, was it really World War I that swung the balance in their favour? So I've just split this into two things. So the first, politics. So suffrage societies never stopped actively campaigning for the vote during the war years. There were marches, there were deputations, there were visible suffrage protests carrying on the entire time. Militancy stopped, but suffrage campaigning did not stop. A change of Prime Minister from Asquith to Lloyd George significantly boosted their chance to be heard. Asquith was very anti-suffragist. The recommendations of the Speakers' Conference and the urgent need for electoral reform meant parliamentarians in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords were more receptive to the idea of women voters. That conversation had come up again. However, if you read Hansard, and do, it's fascinating, key parliamentarians repeatedly stated in debates that if women were enfranchised, it should not be done as a reward for their wartime service. War work. The war made women's work and labour visible in public space and valuable to industry and the military in new ways, but many initiatives were not supported or recognised by the government until the last years of the war, if at all. The idea that some women were enfranchised as a reward for their wartime service, to me, is not persuasive, especially as much of the work undertaken was by women too young or too poor to benefit from the new legislation. Many of the women involved in QMAC, for example, would have been too young and too poor to be enfranchised despite their wartime service. Of course, suffrage campaigners kept going after the war. This is May Whitty, again, speaking at an Actresses Franchise League meeting in 1919 called The Artist's Place in Reconstruction. Quote, on account of the war, they had lost touch with members and friends, but they had all been trying to do their bit, and the League's bit had been pretty extensive. They had not lost sight of the fact that the League was a suffrage society, first and foremost. They were very much alive and kicking, as of old, against injustice and inequality and trying to better conditions. It would take them another 10 years until they got the vote on the same terms of men. 1928 was the passing of the Equal Franchise Bill. So, a few links here. Do take a photo if you want to. I was lucky enough to work in Parliament in 2017-18 on a project called What Difference Did the War Make? World War I and Votes for Women. And the documentation for that is still online, including a digital version of this booklet, which has some of those key things I told you about. It's parliament.uk/whatdifference. That's still there. And if you're interested in the contribution of theatre professionals to the suffrage movement, then I happen to recommend these excellent books. These the two on the end are suffrage plays, but the one in the middle has got all the juicy stuff in. And it's now available in paperback, so it isn't violently expensive. Questions or comments? Thank you so much for your attention. I know it's a whirlwind, but I hope you found something interesting and chewy there. Please do ask any questions. Thank you.